Well, welcome to our last talk of the day. I'm really delighted to be here with our three guests who came all the way from Vienna in Austria and from Houston and New York in the US. So thank you so much for your presence here. I'm Joana Neves. I'm the artistic director of the fair. And so our title is probably a bit enigmatic, The Politics of Drawing, Us and Them. I can very briefly explain why I thought of this theme. The first reason is I organized this congress with these colleagues for university, and we had a keynote speaker who we were delighted to have, Grayson Perry. And of course, he came to disturb us a little bit, to mess us up a little bit, and that was the point, because the title was Stepping Out of Your Comfort Zone. And we thought we were very clever, and he made fun of the title. And obviously, at a certain point, he said something very poignant. He said that we were, in the art world, always talking to ourselves. We're always talking, it's always about us and them. And that really struck me somehow, this separation and the fact that sometimes we're always, very often, we're preaching to the choir. And then I went to Washington for 3 months, and I visited the Drawing Center in New York, and I saw this amazing exhibition called For Opacity, which is a quote from Edouard Glissant. And the quote is, "Agree not merely to the right to difference, but agree also to the right to opacity." And the exhibition was incredibly interesting, and it was really about the notions of representation and the notions of skin and the notions of being in your skin, outside of skin, wearing your skin. Obviously, it was about racial identity, and it was also about gender and sexuality and what you show and what you don't show. And these two things came together, and I thought right there and then that drawing had a certain role in these thoughts that were coming about in the exhibition. And so, yeah, that's how it came about, very briefly. So, without further ado, I'll just jump right in and introduce Edouard Kopp, who was assistant and associate curator of drawings at the Paul Getty Museum for 7 years, and then went on to become associate curator of drawings at the Harvard Museums, where he oversaw a collection of European and American drawings from the 14th century to 1900. He is now, and we're very happy to have him here because it's a brand new position. He was just appointed chief curator of the Menil Drawing Institute in Houston, where modern and contemporary arts are associated. And I'll introduce everyone. Obviously, I'll get to everyone, but I'd just like to ask a question about the Menil and the building itself, which was built for drawing, to show drawing, and it's quite an achievement to just be able to build something around a certain kind of art. So tell us a little bit. And there was a certain amount of attention to light, wasn't it?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. So what you're seeing here is the entrance to the newly erected Menil Drawing Institute, which was opened in last November. And it's not the first institute devoted to, or drawing center devoted to that very medium, obviously, but it's the first structure that is purposefully built for the conservation, the acquisition, the study, but also the display of drawings in America. And just to go back for a second, John and Dominique de Menil, the founders of the Menil, who were of French extraction, as you well know, were passionate about drawing from the 1950s onwards, and they decided gradually to, give more prominence to that. Although, what brought about this institute was mostly the fact of supporters in the Houston area. So we're very excited to have this new structure, which is really devoted to modern contemporary drawings, and by modern I mean, from the late 19th century onwards.
Thank you so much, and welcome to Laura Hoptman. We're delighted to have you here. My notes are here. So you were curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at MoMA? No, I don't.
I was
yes?
both.
Because we were talking about drawing,
Yes,
and
most
now I
recently
think my
the
notes...
Department of Painting and Sculpture, but in the 1990s in the Department of Drawing.
Right, exactly. So there's been a beginning in drawing and now a reconnection with drawing in your career. So you began your career at the Bronx Museum of Arts as an assistant curator in the 1980s. You worked in various institutions, including Carnegie Museum of Arts, and you were curator and head of department of contemporary art at the New Museum. Going back to MoMA, I knew I wanted to establish a relationship very specifically with us. So you curated the exhibition Drawingnow 8 Propositions, which is a very interesting origin for us as an art fair, because we have the same name, we stole your name. And now you've been recently appointed executive director of the Drawing Center. So I would just ask you, how it is to just arrive there, and what, if you can tell us a little bit about the program.
I know that the Drawingnow Art Fair has a connection to the Drawing Center, and that most of you or many of you know what it is. It's a 40-year-old institution in downtown New York, in the Soho section of New York, that was founded by a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, specifically to concentrate on the exhibition and scholarship of drawing. That's it. And it still remains, and its purpose is still the same. And I'm the 4th director to take the position. I started about 6 months ago. And we have a very lively exhibition schedule of drawings with an emphasis on contemporary art, but not necessarily contemporary drawings. In fact, the way we like to think about it is it has an emphasis on contemporaneity, so that things that might be specific to what we're interested in right now is kind of our criterion. We also have a publication series, a journal called Drawing Papers, which is the vehicle through which we publish essays on our exhibitions.
Thank you so much, Laura. And now, finally, Elsy Lahner. Actually, you started by, Elsy founded and ran an art space for young art called Das Weiße Haus in Vienna from 2007, and you ran it until 2011, when you became curator for contemporary art at the Albertina Museum in Vienna. Well, the Albertina has an interesting story. It's related to the Duke Albert of Saxe-Teschen, right? And I think you run a program also in relation to that particular history, because he was a collector. Maybe you want to tell the story. You'll tell it much better than I can.
Maybe. Even the founder of the Albertina, he collected contemporary art. And the basis of our museum, of our collection, are drawings and graphics from the late Gothic until now. So we continued with his tradition to collect contemporary art. And that's what I do as a contemporary art curator. And in the museum we have exhibitions out of our collection, but not just out of our collection. Basically drawings, but some artists we also show in the way they work, so with paintings, with sculptures. And when we buy art, these are drawings and works on paper, everything we consider to be a drawing. Of course, we also have permanent loans and donations by artists or institutions who give us art that is maybe then painting or sculpture, installation, video art, and
And you also curated an exhibition called Drawingnow.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Tell us a little bit about that.
I also stole the name.
It's the common ground we have, except for Edouard.
Yeah. It's a good title, actually. As we said before, there was also a title of an exhibition in the 70s at MoMA, and it traveled to Vienna afterwards, and that's what we related to in our exhibition. It was an exhibition we did in 2015 with about 36 artists showing current tendencies in drawings, which was quite something for us. I know the MoMA did it in 2002, exactly. Yeah. But for us it was quite important to show our visitors, to show our audience, them, what the drawing can be, that it's not just something on paper, but that it can extend the borders of paper and move into space, or be an animated line, for instance.
Thank you so much. So I guess you'll all do a little presentation around the theme with a few selected images between 5 to 10 minutes. So I'll pass you on the clicker, and you can just roll through the images. Thank you so much.
And so the subject of the politics of drawing really is a very rich one. And I thought I'd just start with a few more historical examples before moving on to contemporary examples. And when I think of drawing and politics, or certainly the way in which drawing can be put to the service of certain political aims, I almost immediately thought of this ground drawing by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. So a major sculptor of Papal Rome who was commissioned by Louis XIV, the Sun King, Louis XIV, to come to Paris to make this grand monument, a equestrian monument, which was actually finished, although in a different form, and delivered, but really not very much like. But what we see here is really a kind of greatly aggrandizing drawing, trying to establish or demonstrate the grandeur of absolutist power. So it's really drawing used towards the preparation of sculpture, but eventually to establish power. Another highly political artist, and you could say perhaps the quintessentially political artist, is Jacques-Louis David, who was, as you may or may not know, very involved in the French Revolution. He was actually a close associate of Marat and Robespierre, and he was one of the people who signed the death sentence of the king and the queen. And what you see on the left is a very moving, very spare ink drawing by David of the queen in very simple popular attire. I mean, really clearly she's meant to. She was shown, that new station of being, equal among all, and a very moving, very simple vocabulary of line. And by contrast, the drawing on the right, which is a kind of modern icon, really, and where David depicts his friend Marat, who's just, was assassinated in the same year. The two drawings are from 1793, and you can see inscriptions at the four corners. Marat, l'ami du peuple, David. So to Marat, the friend of the people, David. And what you see on the right is this wonderful idealization. He's a kind of secular saint of a new kind. And certainly by that stage, making depictions of contemporary events was very unusual. And so in this case, you could say these two drawings are political, not only because of the subject matter, but also because of the way, the angle that the artist used and the vocabulary. Just moving on to the kind of opposite genre, which is really attacking ideas of people or causes or parts of society, and it's obviously caricature. A famous lithograph. Lithograph is technically a print, but it's actually conceived as a drawing on stone, so we'll accept it as being relevant. And it's a very interesting caricature of Louis Philippe. And what you see is three faces of Louis Philippe in a kind of pear-shaped arrangement. And the title of the work is actually Le Passé, Le Présent, and Le Futur. So past, present, and future. And from the past, where he's smiling, he turns disgruntled and clearly nasty in the future. So it's a kind of bad omen for the future of the monarchy. And on the right, an excellent example by Georg Grotz showing some of the social and economic tensions of the Weimar Republic. And what you see in the front are three bold, mean-looking, greedy bourgeois, around the table of, playing apparently, but certainly with lots of money on it. And in the background, poor people waiting, and also guards by a factory, whose presence really suggests that there is social tension and things are not going very well. So here, clearly, a vocabulary of sharp lines meant to really attack certain parts of society. But in the case of Grotz, it's not a single person, it's more of a type. And now jumping into the 20th, and in this case, 21st century, two drawings by Jasper Jones, late drawings. And as you know, Jones is very famous for having used again and again certain kinds of motif, especially the flag. If you look at the drawing at upper left, you'll see 2 examples of the flag. And it's a recurrent motif from the 1950s onwards, or mid-1950s onwards. And what's interesting with Johns is, as the ultimate image maker, he plays with highly charged motifs, which in the case of the flag, speak to issues of national identity, and yet deconstructs these images, makes them less familiar, but also use them as structures to create more interesting images. And I'm showing you a recent example from 2014 on the right, which is based on a photograph which you can see at lower left. And it's part of a series based on a photograph showing a Marine during the Vietnam War who's just returned from a helicopter mission and who's lost most of his comrades. And he comes, he's bent over, he's very distraught, very, probably tearful. And it's an image of human collapse. And Jasper Jones, in the drawing on the right, very movingly reuses the motifs, obviously inverting it. And what he does is he's using the structure of the image and in a way fragments it. And the image, in some ways, is on the verge of falling apart in the same way that the subject himself is falling apart. So to what extent is that a criticism of the Vietnam War? Perhaps that's not the question, but certainly with him, there's always this notion of including allusions to events, and yet kind of painterly an aesthetic temptation to go away from this and to be more abstract. An example by, 2 examples by Mona Hatoum, the Lebanese artist. What you see on the left is a work from 2006 and 7. It's, to what extent is that a drawing? I mean, it's what it is. It's a lantern that has been carved, and such lanterns in the Arab world are called misbahs. And what they are normally they are seen in mosques or interiors. And normally the motifs that they have are arabesques. And what she's done is she's used that very refined kind of art and added these very unusual motifs with soldiers with drawn guns, surrounded by what look like stars, but I think they're probably explosions around them. And what Mona Hatoum does is really play with, in a way, she gives a highly refined and almost poetic interpretation of a subject that is really about violence, and she plays with that tension. And essentially, when you see these works, because there are several versions and they come in different sizes, you enter a room and you're completely surrounded by these drawings, effectively on the walls that are projections. She's also made. She actually made some years earlier some cutouts. That here's an example on your right, which are actually folded papers and also cutouts, which she made while in Mexico. And same thing in this case. This is extreme. This is tissue paper. This is the most ephemeral, the most fragile kind of paper, and cuts them in a delightful way. And yet the motifs obviously are all about violence. So it's about creating tensions. And then 3 quick examples that really speak to contemporary American politics, and especially about African American identity. Here's a monumental drawing by Kara Walker from 2017, a drawing that she made in the weeks after the Charlottesville events, where there were very heavily polarized protests, violent protests between white supremacists and counter-protesters, and someone died in the events, and it was a very grim moment for American history. And she was so taken by that she, it seems that she, for many years, she had been doing this incredibly refined cutout of black paper set against a white background. And that summer, she returned to more painterly, or at least draftsmanly technique. And what we see here is a very ambiguous, there's no clear narrative, but what we see are figures, some of them associated with the Civil War. You see at upper right a Confederate flag, and most of them are hanging from dead trees. There's a baby in the left foreground who's bandaging, probably a Confederate soldier. So, and you look at the different figures, and they are lost, they are often alienated, they do absurd things, and it's an image of desolation. So, kind of grim look at American history. An example by Glenn Ligon, who's currently on view at the Musée d'Orsay with some really interesting neon pieces. But this is a work from 1991 where Ligon started to make these very interesting text pieces where essentially he takes excerpts from important texts that by African-American authors, and he tends to take one sentence and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. And the way it's made is he uses a stencil. So in French, that would be a pochoir. And the pochoir is made out of plastic, and he uses a very greasy stick, oil stick. And instead of cleaning the pochoir every few letters, he leaves the material accumulate. And so what you can read at the top becomes completely illegible by the end. And as you can see, the first, the sentence says, "How does it feel to be white you, not with you, but to be, white you?" So it's really about, identity politics. And I should just say very quickly that his background was actually in abstract expressionism, but he had a kind of turn in his career similar, he has said, to what Philip Guston had during the Vietnam War, where he realized that being an abstract artist was no longer viable at a period where there were critical issues that needed to be addressed in a personal way. So he decided to really start to make his cultural identity a center of his art. And I'll just end very, very quickly with some examples by another African-American artist who was really has been very prolific for since the 1970s, and he's called William Pope L. He's based in Chicago. He works across different media. He does a lot of performances and also paintings and drawings. And this is part of a set which is actually ongoing, where he's interesting, of course, in African-American identity, but in a way he goes way beyond that. And what he does, he uses or reuses prejudices that people have, and it's about race, it's about also the absurdity of language, and clearly he's a witty guy, but also a clear provocateur, and you can't ignore what he writes. And he does similar things in the realm of performance. So it's a kind of, whereas Ligon and Walker really focus on African-American identity, you could say that that William Popel goes beyond. He does, obviously, he has preoccupation for that subject, but he goes beyond that. So perhaps I should leave it there. Thank you.
Laura, let's move on to you.
I love that Widow Gachet. David, it's so moving. Whoops, that's not me.
I'm so sorry.
Next.
This is not the order I thought. Elsy, please.
Elsy, go ahead. I'll finish.
So I won't exactly stick to the order of the images, but use them more as a basis for the further discussion, maybe. I thought I would like to start talking about an exhibition I did last year with Dieter Buchert on Keith Haring. I don't know, it was the first time I thought about him as a draftsman, actually. And Keith Haring had his key moment, so to say, in December 1980, when he went down the subway, down to his studio. He left his flat, went down the subway, and he suddenly saw a black surface, which was actually an advertisement board not in use, and which was covered with a very soft and black paper. And he had never seen it before, although it already existed in the 40s and 50s, and he thought maybe that's a good place to draw on it with chalk. And he went to buy some chalk and started to do drawings on those black surfaces in all those subway stations, and there were plenty of them. And yeah, that's how he found his language. He started with those drawings and intended to reach a broad audience, to reach the passerbys. And those passerbys, they could connect those drawings to a story, or going the one direction or in the other direction. And it's interesting when you see what he did before, that he started with posters on the streets and with fake headline posters and posters saying "clones go home" as he fought against the gentrification of his district. And yeah, and he also did some street art before, but he didn't consider himself to be a street artist. So he was still thinking about a possibility to be part of the art scene, to be part of yeah, art discussion, of course, but not on the streets. And yeah, and that was his solution, of course. And that's where he developed his tags, the baby and the dog and so on, and where he developed all the other figures and his stories. And this is how he yeah, dealt with all the topics like AIDS, like drug abuse, like safer sex, like racial problems and all the things. And he found a kind of humorous way to attract people. But then when you look closer at all his works that we all know, that's why I didn't bring an image, then it's kind of disturbing, and then you get the message. And yeah, nowadays there are a lot of artists working in a similar way. That's why I brought the image of Perry Offski, who's working at the museums, of course, in the museums. But his art can also be found in newspapers, on house walls. And he uses a very reduced way of drawing, reduced to the basics, to the very, yeah, to just some signs maybe, or some words, and also discusses topics like Brexit, for instance, or this is, I guess, also from the MoMA, I think, I'm not sure, the image. And also he always has a notebook with him where he thinks about special situations, political situations, and he makes these notes in his notebooks, and then has a kind of repertoire and uses some of those drawings in his notebooks to put them, to redo them on the wall. And another example might be Robin Road. I guess he was here. Was he here for a performance? No, not sure. No, okay.
We wish.
Yeah, we wish. If you can hear us, they wish. And yeah, Robin Road also deals with topic related to his home country, to South Africa. He now lives in Berlin. And he started with chalk drawings as well. But he found a way to bring them into the museum by taking pictures of it, photos, and he makes photos of all the drawings, puts them together as a tableau, and this becomes a street art, if you want to say so, street art part of museum collections, for instance. So this is kind of an interesting way of how to bring street art into a museum. And another example, that was Robin Road. I go back to Olaf Breuning, a Swiss artist living in New York for plenty of years, who is not just doing drawings, but also photographies and videos and so on. And for him, drawing is something very special. He says he can't do this in his studio, as he does with his art in general, but with drawings he goes and sits in the cafe, for instance, or in some public places, and he's doing some kind of seismographic art with his drawings. He listens to what's going on, and this is a kind of funny example. You have those two girls saying OMG, oh my god, or oh my gosh, whatever, and yeah, he makes those little funny drawings, and sometimes also very political, very critical, but also humorous in a way. So this is a kind of comic-like drawing, and we also know this maybe from Raymond Pettibon, and I quoted you in some essay when you said, for instance, Pettibon is also a comic in a mutated form. I think this is kind of an interesting approach where you have artists dealing with a very let's say, simple language or basics to attract a broad audience and to use drawing as a kind of communication out there on the street, but maybe also in the museum. And you were at the beginning of when we thought about what we could talk about, and when it comes to the politics of drawing, we thought, what could it be? Could it be about, the simplicity, in this way it is, and sometimes it could be about poor materials, as you addressed, and this would be an example. This one. There's also there are some drawings by Olga Janishova at the fair as well, I saw, and this is a very special series of drawings. They're untitled, but also called "A Person Protected By," where she's dealing with illegal immigrants and homeless people in the streets of Moscow, and they're all protected by, or they're looking for. They're kind of protected by books, or by maybe a coat, or by some little something, some little token maybe. And she especially uses charcoal to do these drawings as a pure material. And then on the other hand, another artist who uses charcoal as well is Robert Longo. So this is not about the poor material of charcoal, but he does quite monumental drawings. And on the one hand, he uses charcoal for this clair-obscur effect. So it's something different. You have it in black and white and a charcoal drawing. And we all know those images of refugees and the boats. But in this size and in black and white, it becomes something different and attracts us even more. And another thing which is interesting about this work is that it's very photorealistic, as are, for instance, the drawings by Andra Bowers. I didn't bring an image, but she focuses in some of her drawings on protesters on the streets, and she takes pictures of them, or sometimes also uses images she finds in the internet, and she takes just one person maybe, or just one part of a person, and is drawing it in a also very photorealistic way. And it's somehow about of the slowness of the process. Yeah, it's becoming very slow. You take an image and it's a photo, and everybody's doing this, and it's a quick process. And by drawing it, it becomes slowly, and it's more about awareness. And it's quite interesting about her work. These are just a few examples I wanted to mention, and let's discuss later.
Thank you so much, Elsy. Laura, it's finally you.
Thank you. That was so interesting. And thank you, Joana, for having me and for inviting me onto this panel, because it's a very interesting topic, and one that we think about all the time at the Drawing Center. And this is a shot of the show that you were speaking of, Joana, at the beginning, an exhibition called For Opacity that my colleague Claire Gilman created. It featured 3 artists, and it really did take up this notion of the politics in drawing and make it, I think, a much more complex idea than it might originally seem. The 3 artists included this artist called Toyin Odutula Odita, who is an American artist from a Nigerian parentage, and the strength of her images, I'm sure you know them all, are this exquisite-looking people that she creates out of her own head. This is a portrait of an imaginary person, and of course, in the context of 2019, the United States, it's not only astonishing for its skill, but it's the frisson that we get is. Because it rubs up against, it's dissimilar in a way to the conventional American narrow-minded notions of beauty. The second artist in the exhibition, Elijah Berger, Berlin-based, also American artist, was looking at the notion of opacity, the ability not only to say who you are, but to avoid saying who you are through the use of a sign language created by gay people in the United States in the 1940s and 50s, close to the spoken version of of the language called Polari. But this is a signage that was used to tell people where to go, where the party was, where you could meet somebody. And Berger has collected them and created these drawings. The third artist in Claire Gilman's exhibition, is also an American Chicago-based artist called Nathaniel Mary Quinn. And it's another aspect of the notion of the politics of drawing. We go from the content itself, like you see in Toyin, to the immediacy of a language, like you see in Elijah Berger, and finally the connectivity to the hand of the artist. That's another way of conveying the subject matter of the work. Nathaniel Mary Quinn is a tour de force of charcoal drawings. I don't know if any of you have ever seen them in reality, but it looks, of course, like they are photorealistic drawing mixed with collage. They are not. It's all drawn, so it's almost all trompe-l'oeil. But the very nature of drawing, I would say, as a smaller, lighter, preparatory, ephemeral, what are the other things that we accrue to the idea of drawing? Fast, cheap, and easily distributable, has relegated the medium to follow in the wake of painting and sculpture. I think the reason why we have things like the Drawingnow art fair is to mitigate this. But it's also it also makes it a kind of clandestine medium. And that clandestinaity and its relationship with the so-called popular art, I think, ultimately situates it closer to a kind of language of politics that you can have, a political language that you can have in art. And of course, I'm showing you the great Robert Crumb, and I say in my notes, take Robert Crumb, but you Frenchmen and women have already taken him because he's been a resident here for more than 2 decades. In my opinion, Robert Crumb's draftsmanship rivals that of Daumier, and we did see Daumier in the Poire earlier on, who was another so-called commercial artist whose drawings and prints are among the greatest works of political art in Europe in the past 300 years. And I would add that for us in the United States, Robert Crumb, our Daumier, is probably one of the greatest political artists that we have as well. What Daumier and Crumb remind us is that, quote-unquote, good drawing, i.e. good draftsmanship, exists in the world outside of or beyond the world of fine art. And I'm showing you now this fantastic drawing by the great artist Adrian Piper called Self-Portrait Exaggerating My Negroid Features, and Piper did this in 1981. It is, you would I hopefully agree with me, a beautiful rendering, but it also resembles something outside of a realistic drawing. It resembles a police sketch, and that is part of the point of the work. Contemporary artists are rethinking this notion of realism, and the vocabulary of illustration and the way it's been deployed to create mythologies that construct our narratives, I think is an important element of the notion of the political in drawing. And here I show you a work from 1991 by American, also Chicago-based artist, Carrie James Marshall. And in this work called Study for Blue Water, Silver Moon, it was a study for in fact, another work on paper, not a painting. We see this capo scuolo of American realism right now, recasting, if you will, a fairy tale that we think of in American and European, in notions of American and European fairy tales as not a creature who is black, but in fact the half-fish, half-woman, the mermaid, is as ubiquitous in African mythology as it is in Northern European fairy stories. So it's it's less a claim than in a way a reclamation here. It might stun, and it did in 1991, I think it still does, to see this fairy tale creature, the mermaid, as a person with a dark skin, but in fact, seeing it from another way, it shouldn't at all. So the artist Keith Mayerson, and again, I'm sorry I'm being very American in my presentation. This is called The Joyful Song, Pinocchio the Big Fag, from 1993. So Mayerson did something similar with a 19th century Italian fairy tale, which was made popular by a Disney movie. So fairy tales are often based on myth. Some are fables meant to teach moral rectitude. And Pinocchio is, of course, a fable that illustrates the consequences of lying. And thus, it makes perfect sense for Mayerson to hijack this as a coming-out story. What if, Mayerson asks us, Pinocchio told the truth? Now, and in this case, as you can see, Mayerson also adopts a drawing style that mimics Tennille's illustrations to Alice in Wonderland. So it's a given that there's a politics in the way a work of art is made. I mean, that's what I've been trying to say about drawing, but it needs to be emphasized, particularly in the case of works on paper, because techniques are often very telling. None more so than the work of David Hammons, again, another American artist, but not Chicago-based, actually Springfield, Illinois-based, 2 hours outside of Chicago. At the end of the 1960s, all the way through the beginning of the 1970s, he did a very important series of works in which he created a self-portrait of himself using the imprint of his own body on the paper. So the self-portrait is a lot more than just a representation of David Hammons. In fact, it's the residue of David Hammons. So what we're seeing here, wrapped in the flag, is David Hammons. It's a brilliant, I think, and radical translation, and again, I'm bringing up somebody that we spoke about before, of a similar principle, which was evident in Jasper Johns and his use of the flag. Like the flag, David Hammons' body oscillates between being the thing itself and the representation of a thing. Again, I'm copying my colleague here by bringing up Kara Walker, and the reason why I'm bringing up Kara Walker is that this is another example of technique speaking as loudly as content in terms of politics. Walker has commandeered a common European, but in the United States, an antebellum folk craft. The black paper cutout was the kind of thing that in pre-Civil War South, women would do. It was women's fancy work that they would do sitting on a porch, say. So if you think about this as the language and the craft of plantation ladies done at their leisure while slaves worked outside, an African-American artist like Kara Walker, who was brought up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, the center of the antebellum South, has sort of taken this away, reappropriated that technique for something of her own. There are also artists who draw to do things, that is, using drawing as a tool or a weapon. Here is a war drawing by the American artist Kim Jones, who's been doing this work for his entire artistic career, and that's a career that began after 2 tours as a Marine in the Vietnam War. When he came back from the war, Jones started this drawing cycle, and in a way, he's never stopped fighting, but he's done so on paper. These works, if they stay in his possession, are never finished. They remain activated. He still is playing the war game between the X's and the O's. He does it by addition and erasure. So this is a strange juxtaposition, but I'm doing it anyway. It's a recent drawing by Tricia Donnelly that you might have been able to see here in Paris on view in her gallery at Air de Paris in January and February. By the way, she's the daughter of a Marine vet. I think I was going to add that. So this work is as activated a thing as someone like Kim Jones. For Donnelly, you see, drawing isn't a representation of something, but it is something. The paper for her is a site of construction, much like a site of activity that Jones used. And the motif itself is a mechanism that always does something, from serving as a screen to boring through a wall. She even uses the term not to draw, but she says she builds her drawings rather than draws or sketches them. I want to bring up one more thing, and this has to do with an exhibition that's opening at the Drawing Center at the beginning of October. I hope that if you all are in New York, you'll see it. It'll be up from October 3rd to the beginning of January. This is a work by Gustave Courbet from 1871, poor guy, incarcerated and accused of tearing down the Vendôme column. So singling out drawing to examine its political nature and its possibilities bring us back to the medium itself. And it's a question that this exhibition that we are going to do at the Drawing Center asks. The show is called The Pencil is a Key, Drawings by Incarcerated Artists. And it asks the question, what is it that makes artists turn to drawings in the face of human situations caused by realpolitik, in extremis, that is, drawings created by artists who become prisoners. And over the past 6 months, the Drawing Center has undertaken a vast research of drawings by incarcerated artists. This is one that has been uncovered, lived here in Paris. Actually, now it lives in Ligon, by an inmate of Mazas prison from I think this is 1879 from Mazas prison. And it's our contention, and this is a work by Alexei Wagenheim, somebody incarcerated in the Gulag in 1939, that borne out by the anecdotal evidence that we have from some of these drawings, that artists who were deprived of their freedom turned most frequently to drawing as a way to reinforce their humanity by by doing a couple of things, by asserting their identity, like Wagenheim did here. He was a horticulturalist, or Hans Bellmer did in a group of drawings that he completed when he was incarcerated at the Camp des Mis in Aix as an enemy alien, or as Zerha Dogan did very recently. This is a work from 2018. Dogan is a Kurdish artist who was imprisoned by the Erdogan government and released this month after 3 years in prison. Her crime was caricaturing the government strongman Erdogan, but the prison drawings that she made, which were often from her own bodily fluids, are evidence of her living self. That is, again, a kind of, if we think about David Hamm, as a kind of self-portraiture. Here's a work by, I'm sorry, I'm showing all these because they're fantastic, it's new material, by Aza Abo Rabia. It's called Portrait of Naifer from 2016. Rabia is from Syria, and she was imprisoned during the civil war. She's now safely in Beirut, and this is a portrait of her friend and fellow inmate. So drawing was used for the incarcerated artists to assert their identity or to come to terms with their circumstances. This is a work by Mine Ekuba, an American imprisoned in detention camps after the U.S. declared war on Japan. You all probably know that starting in 1942, the United States imprisoned our own citizens who were of Japanese descent. Here's a work, this is probably the best known work that I'm showing in this area. This is the great Ibrahim El-Salahi, a Sudanese artist called, this is Prison Notebook #1, and he chronicled his imprisonment in this. Or a work by someone like Fatima Mir, again, an enormously well-known South African artist who in 1976 was imprisoned for her anti-apartheid activities and also chronicled her experiences with drawings. And these works, and there's something like 18 to 20 of them, live in Johannesburg in a museum that has created a structure around these drawings. They're national treasures, and they don't leave South Africa. Finally, we've found that incarcerated artists use drawing to envision their freedom. And this is an illustration of a letter drawn and written by Herman Wallace, one of the Angola Three, who was incarcerated for 42 years in solitary confinement in Angola prison in Louisiana. So we started this research because as curators working in America, mass incarceration is an issue that's at the very, very, very center of our society, and it's hard not to notice that the proliferation of works on paper made by artists and prisoners, artist-prisoners, no matter the circumstances of their incarceration, are in fact drawings. They're using this language. So we might have started there, but we've concluded with the realization and a renewed sense, and I think that this is why I brought this material here to this discussion, that drawing is crucially important as a means of expression, but it's not just crucial, it's not just elemental, but it's essential when you're talking about the politics of art, qua art. Anyway, our exhibition opens on October 3rd, and you can see for yourself. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your passion, all of you. And Laura, thank you for giving us a preview of your next show, which is incredibly moving and is actually a political act in itself, it seems. Really taking a stance in politics today, and particularly in American politics. So it really is the institution itself that actually is taking a stand, and it takes the discussion elsewhere. It takes the discussion to the museum itself and to showing drawing as a political act. And Elsy, you also spoke about being outside and inside the institution and how artists bring, like Robin Rhodes, they kind of shift things and they shift languages and they bring the language of the street inside the museum, which of course takes us to audiences and takes us to the body and the body of the artist and the poor material of drawing, and how the bodily fluids became also the material, can become the material of drawing. And that can be a political act in itself. I was also thinking, I'm just unpacking a little bit and very quickly because we don't have a lot of time, about the idea of the monument that you started with and how you rediscussed the idea of the monumentality of Robert Longo's drawing, but in a completely different way in terms of the poor material that doesn't look poor per se. So there's this monumentality of the image, but the material is exactly the same. And also how the idea of national identity that you mentioned, Edouard, becomes a notion of community and becomes a notion of the dissolution of the self, because it's no longer about representing someone or representing a political movement, but really trying to make the drawing itself shift identities by becoming itself a form of identity or a sort of exploration of the very notion of identity. I guess I have I'm bringing things down a little bit because you guys took the discussion very, very far. But I was wondering, because we have one curator from Europe, 2 curators from America, and you brought very American issues. Is there a difference in politics and in the representation of politics, or the politics of drawing, the separation between us and them in Europe as compared to the United States? Edouard is a little bit of a spy because you're French, but you live in
I did want to bring up one thing. I think that what we have in common vis-a-vis drawing is the difference between us and them has a parallel in the notion of high and low. And I think it's very important to bring that up vis-a-vis drawings. And you did with your use of Daumier. And you began with that. In other words, popular culture versus so-called museum culture or high culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a crucial point. A certain artist really really enriched by popular culture, as you mentioned, Raymond Pettibon, and he's a great example of that, where he can he draws a lot of energy and strength from surfing culture, punk culture, popular culture, but also he makes his art in a way much more powerful to so many, because he uses the language of illustration and comics and so on. So it's not, by using that, he makes his drawings even more powerful. And
subversive.
Subversive, certainly,
I mean, it's the same with Dan Perry, who was the Minister of Culture for a while in Romania, actually. And he started, so he had always 2 hats as this, like Daumier, a publisher and somebody who was doing political cartoons and also working in places like this, at fine art museums as well. And I think that that's one thing that drawing can do. It's a kind of, this notion of clandestinity is really something that's gives the strength to drawing. And that's why prisoners use it. You can smuggle a pencil and a piece of paper in very easily.
It may be you could say it's quite hard to request, like an easel and oil paints and brushes. So I'm not, I think it's going to be a very interesting exhibition, and clearly, I like the 2 of you, I like the 3 of you, I strongly believe in the power, the essential power of drawing as medium, but also there are practical circumstances which, dictate also the,
that's the blurring of boundaries that we clearly saw in so many ways here. So Elsy, do you see, there was a lot of very current politics that were mentioned. Do you think here in Europe we are at the same level? Because I spent 3 months in the US, and I was really struck by the fact that, I'm going through Brexit in the UK at the moment, and I don't particularly see it. I see it more in galleries and commercial galleries, the notion being tackled than institutionally, I guess. Mm-hmm. So do you think that there's a difference between the politics of drawing in Europe around here?
It depends on what countries we're talking about.
Obviously.
It depends on the
even America is different countries, and sometimes it feels like different.
I think when we talk about Portugal or Spain, it may be different in England, and maybe different in Austria, of course. Yeah. But I think, maybe the artists we all mentioned, the American artists, they are more the established ones and known internationally, and maybe also already made their ways into the museums, and it would be interesting to see. Yeah.
I remember. So the the large drawing by Kara Walker I showed was at a show at Sycamore Jenkins in New York, and she wrote a very interesting artist statement, which is a kind of non-statement, where she was really mocking the very genre of artist statements and resenting that somehow she was the kind of token, successful, smart, highly educated African-American woman. So she seems to resent that. I mean, she probably enjoys the success and the recognition, but at the same time doesn't like the kind of role model that she I mean, we might have a different idea, but this was my take.
No, I was just going to add it was a press release, which made it even more interesting. Rather than it was an artist statement, but in the form of a press release. And yes, and her consciousness of who she is has been from the very beginning. Her beginnings in Houston, her first important exhibition was in Houston, and her first as a student, and her first public exhibition was at the Drawing Center in 1995. But yes, the answer is yes, she has this complex.
Well, thank you very much. This was incredibly exciting. Maybe I'll just see if anyone has any questions. Is there someone with a microphone out there? I don't think so. Are there any questions from the audience? I'm sure there are. Please, be brave. Will, it's always you. If there aren't any questions, I just want to thank you so much for your generosity and your presentations and for being here. And I hope you continue enjoying the fair. Thank you very much.
Thank you.